So hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I'm Katira Noviello Kapoor, and I have the privilege of being the Senior Director of Health Promotion, Wellness, and the Spark Your Health Talk series here at the 92nd Street Y. Thank you all for being with us in honor of International Women's Day coming up on Friday. This evening, Spark Your Health is joined by authors Cara Alamo and Kate Mann, who will be leading us in a timely discussion of the influences of social media on the lives of women and girls, as well as the radical re-evolution of how body image impacts all facets of our lives. Our format this evening will be a moderated discussion followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please feel free to submit those questions throughout the duration of the program, as we'll be collecting them in the chat. We hope you will be able to join us for upcoming Spark Your Health events, such as Inspiring Our Kids to Move More, a conversation on physical wellness in children and the role of family with Dr. Amy Bantham. That's coming up next Thursday, March 14th, along with many other events. I would also like to thank our Spark Your Health Talk series sponsor, Mount Sinai Health System, for their generous support. I am now pleased to introduce our speakers this evening. Cara Alamo is an author and associate professor of communication at Farley Dickinson University, where she created the university's programs in social media. She writes about the social impact of social media and issues affecting women for CNN Opinion, and is a former communicator at the United Nations and in the Obama administration. Her academic research on social media has been published by media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and many more. Cara's new book, Over the Influence, Why Social Media is Toxic for Women and Girls and How We Can Take It Back, was just released yesterday. So congratulations on the book release, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And also we are joined this evening by Kate Mann. Kate is an associate professor of philosophy at Cornell University, having previously been a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. She works in moral, social, and feminist philosophy. In addition to academic journals, her work has appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, the Huffington Post, and many more. Her first book, Down Girl, was awarded the Prose Award for Excellence in Philosophy and in the Humanities, and it also won the American Philosophical Association Book Prize. Her third book, Unshrinking, How to Face Fat Phobia, came out this past January. So welcome, Kate, and congratulations on the release of your book earlier this year.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both for being with us this evening. Really looking forward to diving in, and I know everybody with us tonight is as well. So, Cara, again, congratulations on the book just releasing, and I think in honor of that, we'll start with you for the first question. So in your first chapter of your book, Girl Meets Instagram is the title of that chapter. It looks at how social media affects teen girls. So can you tell us about that and the advice you offer parents for handling their daughter's use of it?
Yeah, so the thing about social media is that so much of it depends on how you use it. So one story that I tell in my book is of a woman named Vivian who says that she got her eating disorder on Instagram as a teenager. But then I also talk about how social media can be a lifeline for girls. It can be a lifeline for girls who are minorities in their physical communities, and then they go online and they find healthy communities, they find their people. It can be a place where girls develop interests that turn into careers or get involved in important social justice movements. And so, unfortunately, because tech companies do such a terrible job of policing their platforms, it's really on us as parents to help our daughters get this right. Some advice that I give to parents is instill values really early on that will be needed when our daughters eventually join social media. One of my favorite parts of Kate's book, Unshrinking, was where she talked about pulling out her phone during the pandemic and pulling up Instagram and showing her young daughter pictures of people of all different sizes and races and levels of ability, and remarking on how she was so glad that these people are in the world with us. And I don't think I've ever read a better piece of advice for parents on how to teach our children how to look at people and not judge them based upon their appearances. And I think that that's just so important. It's so important to instill these values about why we practice kindness to everyone, even when they're different from us, because our kids are going to need that as they get older. I also think it's a really good idea when our kids are young to start talking early to the parents of their friends and collectively agree that we'll hold off on letting them use social apps until they're a bit older. One thing that research out of the UK does tell us is that when girls between the ages of 11 and 13, which is the age that they typically go through puberty, use social media, that is associated with lower life satisfaction a year later. And so I think it is the case, some parents might think, my daughter's eventually going to get a phone. Do I want to fight this battle every single day for the next year? Why not just give it to her now? I think there is evidence to tell us that if possible, it makes sense to try to wait until they're a little bit older and out of that critical window. And then I think it's a really good idea when girls are on social media to constantly remind them why we don't judge people for their appearances, to try to be up on what's happening on social media. And you don't have to use TikTok or Snapchat yourself just to be aware of what's happening in the news. So, for instance, right now, one of the big trends on TikTok lately has been, Sephora kids and Botox babies content, telling 10-year-olds to, put on full faces of makeup and telling 20-year-olds to get Botox. Even if you're not on TikTok, if you're reading the New York Times, you're going to be aware of that trend. And then to have that conversation with your daughter, right? Because that's what she's being exposed to now. Another big conversation to be having with daughters who are on social media now is about deep fakes and the danger of the fact that now it's super easy with artificial intelligence to create fake images. And surprise, surprise, the majority of deep fakes are pornographic, right? So that's a huge danger to all of our children of all genders. But I think it's important to be having these conversations with kids now about why if your nude image shows up on social media, you're at greater risk of sexual assault and depression and suicide. It's going to be harder for you to find a job. It's going to be harder for you to date. So sexting is not okay. And these are all conversations that we have to have with our daughters.
And I love that tip that you mentioned about the collective, getting other parents involved and kind of, because I'd imagine that must be really hard for, a 12-year-old to be one of the only ones not involved. So I think that's a brilliant suggestion of getting all the parents on board so that that kind of becomes the norm within that little community. Kate, did you have anything to add to that? I know that Kara had like a nice example of something that you do with your own daughter.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that example. It came about partly because I felt in the pandemic, because our family was very cautious because my husband is immunosuppressed and immunocompromised, so we weren't seeing many people. I wanted her to see the diversity that the world has to offer. I wanted her to see bodies that are non-white and disabled and trans and larger bodies and bodies of all shapes and sizes and gender expressions and so on, to really demonstrate to her that we don't look at bodies with a critical eye. We are just happy that we share the world with so many amazing people. And so, yeah, I would, because of this lack of real world interaction that we were going through, I would just pull up Instagram and show her the diversity that I think we ought to value. And another point that Kara touched on that I think her book brilliantly delves into is, to some extent, we can, as parents, put measures in place to protect children from some of the really dangerous potential consequences of the internet in general and social media in particular. But we also need to teach them those values that will help them to navigate potential risks that we can't always mitigate. So it reminds me of Virginia Sole-Smith's advice in her book, Fat Talk, Parenting in the Age of Diet Culture, to not necessarily try to censor every problematic piece of media, so much as to have those conversations very early on as to our family believes in bodily diversity and that everyone is equal and so on and so forth in an age appropriate way, bringing in elements of history that have gone against that humane and moral bedrock sensibility that everyone is equal. So yeah, the idea that we're not trying to completely insulate our children from some of these problems, but be cautious about the introduction of these media and also instill critical thinking skills so that they can navigate material they will be exposed to, like it or not, sooner or later, hopefully later.
Hopefully. So sticking with social media for another moment, Kara, back to you. You write that social media is a toxic place for women, but at the same time, you don't think the answer is necessarily for us to go and delete all of our apps. So can you explain your thinking there?
Yeah, so this is a common piece of advice given to women. If social networks are so toxic, just stop using them. But of course, social media is also a place where Kate and I promote our books, where we connect with other people in our fields, where we get involved in important causes. And so, it's a tool for empowerment, and it is absolutely unacceptable to me that women should be told that we can't or shouldn't use it simply because lawmakers and tech companies are falling down on the job of making them, safe, positive places for us. And so my answer is very much to fix what's wrong with social media. I also think it's a solution that wouldn't work anyway, because even if women stopped using social networks, I think the fact is that what's happening on social networks is making the offline world more dangerous for women and girls. And the only way to solve that problem is, of course, to fix social networks. So, for example, just over the past 6 years or so, we've seen a lot of extremist misogyny that used to be in sort of darker corners of the internet, like Reddit, spill over into places like youth culture on TikTok. And now it's kind of a common part of youth culture on TikTok to do things like joke about violently abusing women. I interviewed an expert, Caitlin Rieger in London, for my book, who made the point that this is unique compared to other forms of extremism. So it's not common on TikTok for kids to joke about beheading other people, for instance. But for some reason, this misogyny is acceptable. And I think what that is doing is normalizing the abuse of women and violence towards women and the deprivation of rights and resources that women need offline, and changing the way that people view and treat women, because this is becoming normalized. And so I think this is one part of the puzzle, but partly what can help explain everything from the overthrow of Roe versus Wade, to a significant increase in the CDC's last survey, which was published last year, in the number of high school girls who say that they've been forced to have sex. So leaving social media is not going to solve that problem for us. What's going to solve the problem is tech companies no longer allowing this kind of extremist sexism and misogyny.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me a bit, Cara, of the "what was she wearing" trope that is effectively victim blaming to people who are using technology that we should have access to. And as you just pointed out, oftentimes we need access to it in order to do our work or be socially connected and all sorts of benefits that social media has. But the idea of, essentially, as I've often been told, as someone who works in areas that do sometimes attract online hostility, to put it mildly, the reaction can be a little bit, well, what was she tweeting? So effectively blaming the victim of misogynist attacks for attracting that trolling and abuse and harassment and threats, rather than saying we need to make these platforms safe.
Exactly.
All right, so shifting a little bit here, thank you both for that. So Kate, we'll shift over to you for a minute. You mentioned in your book, which released earlier this year, that you consumed positive content on social media, like health at every size, But for a long time, it wasn't powerful enough to overcome the powerful fat phobia messages that you were getting from society at the very same time. So the question is there anything we and others can do to make the positive content more prominent, more effective to all of us, and of course for our daughters on social media? And perhaps you can even get into the definition of fat phobia a little bit to help set the stage for the rest of the talk.
Yeah, absolutely. So I define fat phobia as the unjust downranking of larger bodies in terms of thinking that people who are larger, or I also use the word fat in a neutral way, not as a pejorative term, but as a term just like short or tall. So people in fat bodies are downranked in terms of our intellectual ability, in terms of our moral status, in terms of our aesthetic and sexual value. And I also argue in my book that there are various overinflated views that proliferate about the relationship between weight and health that is actually rather complex. So there's the sense that anyone who's larger is kind of doomed to die of fatness, which is false and a market oversimplification of a much more complex and nuanced picture. So that is how I think about fat phobia, just basically holding that people are superior in as much as they're thin. In this whole range of dimensions. So yeah, I had an interesting positive experience in my early 20s on the internet where I discovered people who were essentially laying the groundwork for body positivity and fat acceptance and taking pride in dressing fashionably as a larger person. All sorts of writing that was really powerful, saying that people who are larger are treated unjustly, especially in the medical system. Content like that really was so influential to me as someone who had just never come across this idea that maybe trying to shrink my body wasn't the answer to my body image issues. Maybe it is actually much more about changing the world to accommodate everyone in a just way. And that content was very powerful and convinced me politically from a young age that we have to think about fat phobia as a social justice issue. But I also am someone who spent the next 25 years still not really internalizing the personal piece of that and still trying to diet and shrink my body and still struggling with body image in ways that I think will be familiar to many girls and women. And I'm sure that being exposed to the proliferation of images celebrating thinness had a lot to do with that. So in terms of practical tips, one thing that's really powerful that people can do if they want to cultivate a better body image and also address fat phobia as a social justice issue is curate their social media feed. So stop following people who you think are glorifying thinness in ways that are not healthy for you to look at. You can, unfollow or just, mute that account or whatever the equivalent is on a particular platform. And also following accounts of people who come in a diverse range of shapes and sizes and are doing cool things and showing that you can be larger and brilliant, larger and kind, larger and morally courageous, all the good things that we want our children to instantiate as qualities too. So I think that curation of social media can be really powerful in saying, who do I want to be both in solidarity with, but also bearing witness to in terms of who is it helpful for me to be looking at on a daily basis.
I think, yeah, I just have to say, I think that's so beautiful. And not only that, I think it would be so great for parents to help their daughters do that work of curation, because it would be teaching them an important lesson. But even more than that, if you're looking with your daughter at this content, then when she's in her account and you're no longer there, you've sent a signal to that social network's algorithm that she wants to see more of it. And it will recommend more of it for her. Just like we know that if a girl goes online and searches for negative content, TikTok will promote, tummy tuck surgery to a 13-year-old, right? And so I think it's a really great idea for parents to help their daughters. I've talked to so many parents who will tell me, again, I don't know how TikTok works. I don't know how Snapchat works. And so they're just really intimidated by this. But no problem. If your daughter's on TikTok, she knows how it works. So just ask if you can sit down with her and look for content together.
And I think it's a good reminder for adults too, because you kind of just like live with what you've maybe started following 10 years prior, and you don't think about that, like that, oh, I don't have to be stuck with this. I have the power here to follow and unfollow. So I think that's a really, really good practical tip. Thank you for that. Okay, so this is for both of you, but Kara, we'll throw it to you first. There's a common conception that when it comes to body image, that Gen Z they're doing all right, having come so far from the thin, obsessed 90s culture. But over the influence casts some doubt on that narrative. Can you talk through some of the many ways that social media drives body dissatisfaction, eating disorders, and even overexercise among young people, especially girls, and how it's kind of baked into health and wellness content sometimes?
So when I was growing up, I read magazines, and some of those magazines showed images that are arguably worse than a lot of the images girls might see on Instagram today, right? Those truly anorexic looking models of the 1980s. But the crucial difference is that I got that magazine once a month, and I didn't sit there and stare at those bodies for hours. And now, many girls are spending hours every day scrolling through platforms like Instagram. I think the visually oriented platforms are far worse for kids' mental health than others, because it puts the focus on people's bodies and their appearances. It's easy for adults, let alone our children, to lose sight of the fact that what they're seeing on social media just isn't real. And so the so-called Instagram body can usually only be achieved through surgery. Um, People are posting heavily filtered images online, and of course, the glamorized versions of their lives. And one thing that I call on tech companies to do is to signal to us when images are manipulated. Because I think if we saw that signal on the majority of images we were looking at, we, and of course, young girls, would come to see that it's not a realistic depiction of people's bodies. But I fear that girls who spend hours a day scrolling through Instagram come to feel like their bodies are less than. I interviewed a plastic surgeon for my book who talked about the fact that before social apps landed in our lives, you might have had your photo taken at a wedding or at a birthday party. But now we're all constantly bombarded with images of ourselves. And that is fueling this huge rise in body dissatisfaction, right? The images that friends post or we take and post ourselves. And that is what has driven the huge increase in plastic surgery in the United States since these apps took off. So it's something that, I think is affecting not just girls, but also, women as well.
Kate, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, that was so valuable and insightful. And yeah, I think that what happens sometimes is we see some progress in certain spaces online. So we do see that there is what I would see as more positive content, content that celebrates diversity of bodies and that is not lionizing leanness. But then the backlash to that is often really vitriolic and kind of doubles down on ideals that have not been supplanted. They're competing with these new forms of, again, I think more positive content. So the metaphor that I like for this is that it's not even that we make progress and then we have a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, linear to and fro. It's more like a do-si-do dance, is Tressie McMillan Cottom's metaphor, where it's actually in lockstep. The fact that there's more positive content that celebrates diverse bodies means there's simultaneous backlash that can be very influential on young people that, again, doubles down on some of the ideals that are so harmful with demonstrable effects. So we know that a majority of girls by the age of 10 will have already been on a diet. We know that 1 in 10 members of Gen Z will play around with some kind of weight loss drug, such as now proliferating on TikTok is the idea of budget Ozempic, which is just a laxative. So I really do feel like even though we have this sense that things are improving and that's accurate, we also have ways in which the reaction to that drives many of these issues because there is a doubling down on ideals that people are reluctant to let go of, like the thin ideal. Yeah, so that's kind of how I see it. It's not progress and backsliding, it's the two, progress and backlash, are in constant lockstep, competing with one another, and that affects members of Gen Z who are often very ambivalent, really, about their bodies, I think.
Well, and I think a nice way to kind of end off that section is the three of us are girl moms, and I know we think a lot about how to raise our daughters and what can be a very toxic world for women at times. We already touched upon earlier, Kate, the practice that you had mentioned with Instagram and showing different body types and really embracing and teaching that to your daughter, that we want to embrace all of these people. It makes it a more interesting, more diverse, richer world. But do you have any other tips between the two of you on ways that we can help our daughters treat themselves and others with respect through all of the research that you've done for your books?
So I think diverse children's literature is also a really wonderful way to celebrate bodies in all of their diversity. So as well as thinking about the online version of this, I think it is important, especially I think of this as a parent who is white, as well as cisgender, non-disabled, and someone who wants to raise my daughter in a body positive way. I'm trying to think about representation, both online in terms of what she sees content-wise, but since she's not getting a whole lot of screen time, I'm not saying there's never the old afternoon with Bluey episodes on rerun, but we try and keep it not too much. But yeah, thinking about as a parent, children's books that celebrate a kind of diversity of diversity. I think it's a familiar idea to many white parents that we need to be thinking about racial diversity in children's literature, but there are also wonderful books, like, just to throw out a name, the book Bodies Are Cool by Tyler Feder really shows like the full spectrum of people with scars and facial differences and limb differences and all shapes and sizes and so on. And getting to hear my daughter repeat the line, the mantra, bodies are cool, and looking at all these differences in a way that is positive and embracing of them, not kind of shameful or scared that we're all different. I think that is a parenting practice that is, one that, at least for me, works well to instill the values that I want to instill in her and teach her that whatever her body turns out to be, it's cool.
I love that. I think just preaching the values of kindness and thinking about consent early on are really important. I'm constantly reminding my daughter of the privileges she has in life, how lucky she is to have the things around her, which, when you're in preschool, you might take for granted. I'm always telling the story about my youngest brother, who was the cool kid in high school, who went around to tables where kids were eating lunch on their own and brought them to his table. And I always tell my daughters that that's what I want them to do when they grow up. And then also just talking about how consent is important. I was telling Kate this story that I've been recording podcasts about my book, and my kids were homesick watching Coco Melon while I recorded a podcast. So I was trying to explain to them why this conversation was so important. And it was a conversation about consent. And so I said to my daughter, who is in preschool, what would you do if someone asked you to do something that made you feel uncomfortable? And she looked at me like she could not fathom why I was asking her such an obvious question. She said, of course I would say no. But of course the question is, will she do so when she's 13, right? And so it's constantly feeding those values, knowing that they are going to be getting the opposite message from our society.
Yeah, I think that consistency is key. Thank you both so much. Really, really good tips. So let's shift into moms for a moment, or I guess sticking with moms. Kara, in your book, you have 2 chapters on how misinformation is targeted specifically to mothers. Can you tell us more about this and what we can do about it, and maybe some of the threats that it poses?
So I think some of this happens very intentionally and some of it happens unintentionally. But I think that there are plenty of savvy people who've realized that people like new moms or moms of kids who have severe disabilities or other challenges are very vulnerable, right? As a new mom, you're often isolated. You're trying to protect your kid from germs in the first few weeks of life. You're home with your child, and pretty much one of the only easy things to do while you're feeding your child is to scroll on your phone, right? And moms have so many questions. How do you deal with feedings? How do you deal with sleep? I mean, all the new things that you're facing in life. And so it's such a vulnerable time. And so there are people who prey on that. There are people who go after moms who have just lost a child to convince them that vaccines were to blame, which of course is impossible, or who go after moms of severely autistic kids who struggle to leave their homes and sell them quack products because they know that a mother will try anything and do anything to help her child, right? And then some of it happens unintentionally. There's this whole world of momfluencers. I really work very hard not to hate on influencers in my book. The majority of influencers are women. And I talk at great length about how they're often exploited themselves and up against a whole lot of challenges. They rarely earn a salary at the federal poverty level. It's a tough job. But I think a lot of moms don't have many places to get validation in our society. And so it can be tempting, whether it's looking for validation or whether it's needing a flexible job, right, where you can balance your childcare responsibilities with trying to earn some income, say, while your kids are in school. So it can be very tempting to share your advice, your parenting advice, regardless of whether you have scientific or medical or other expertise. And sometimes, moms will share things and it can work for your kid, and that's great. But then we see some very dangerous things like people sharing recipes for homemade baby formula, particularly during the recent shortage, when we know that there is unfortunately no safe way to make baby formula at home with the proper mix of nutrients that infants need. Those ingredients can't be store-bought. So there's so much misinformation out there. And I am concerned about the effects on mothers from a lot of this momfluencer content. A number of therapists have come to my book events, and they tell me that they hear from their clients that, they watch a quick clip of a therapist and it seems brilliant and it's just the advice they need. Why can't I operationalize that, right? And part of it is that it is very complex to operationalize psychological advice in the context of a family. But then the other part of it, of course, is that what works for one mom might not work for another. One thing I know from having 2 children is that every child is different. And so when a mom is, creating a TikTok explaining how she got her kid to sleep, that explains what worked for her kid. And if it works for your kid, fabulous, as long as it's not dangerous. But if it doesn't, so many moms are taking the message from it that they are failures and that something is wrong with them for not being able to apply this advice, rather than taking the message that it's great that that worked for her and it doesn't work for my child or in the context of my life circumstances. And I think that has a huge effect on women's mental health.
Kate, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I no, that's so insightful, Cara. And I think there is a kind of echo of this in some of the content of which I'm critical in my book in terms of diet culture, where you'll get a huge proliferation of videos. This is how I lost weight. And it really, we have to be careful in terms of the data that's being gathered there. That's N of one. And as we know from study after study, people can lose weight on any number of diets and exercise plans and what have you. But the problem is that the weight comes back really inexorably for the vast majority of people in the long term. And so what you'll get is people posting things like what I eat in a day videos, which can really veer into disordered eating territory in some cases, showing calorie counts that are way too low to sustain the body, but also showing kind of transformation videos of weight loss, not showing the aftermath of that for people's metabolism or the possibility that they will then regain the weight, which is what happens in the majority of cases. And yeah, you have this way people are generalizing from what has worked or ostensibly worked in a case of exactly one themselves, where they are not even comparing themselves to an alternate them, like who knows what the alternative would be. Maybe the baby was going to sleep anyway at that point developmentally, or maybe someone who got healthier would have had a recovery regardless of them eating extra kale or more expensive smoothies or what have you. So you have this fundamental lack of information as well as misinformation. You have people touting advice that really isn't based on sufficient data collection. It's based on one person, not comparing them to a control group. They're just kind of saying, this is my quote unquote success story. And that is precarious, both empirically and in terms of giving hope to people who feel vulnerable, who desperately say want to lose weight and who are capable of being influenced very easily to try things that may not be feasible or safe or sustainable in the long term.
Absolutely. So shifting into body positivity, which has become a popular social media hashtag, but in some ways it can remain shallow still, sometimes linked to capitalist profiteering. How do femvertisements like Dove's Real Beauty campaign exploit women's existing insecurities? And they still remain limited to narrow beauty ideals while promising the opposite. So how are these ads keeping us focused on fixing ourselves and not the world around us, as I think both of you powerfully argue?
So I look a lot at femvertisements, and I think the sad thing is that they are one of the prominent ways that feminism or so-called feminism has been represented on social media in recent years. And it's this content from brands telling women to just act confident and, no matter what you look like, you're beautiful. Well, let's unpack that for a minute. Dove's Real Beauty campaign featured women who, in fact, were airbrushed, who were, I would argue, quite conventionally attractive. The company, while Dove was running these campaigns telling women they're beautiful, they were simultaneously running, or the parent company was simultaneously running ads for Axe deodorant, basically telling men that, if they use the product, conventionally attractive women would sleep with them. And so, it didn't seem like that message went beyond the company's bottom line. But I think ultimately what's problematic about it is what we've been talking about, right? This idea that it keeps the focus on women's bodies. It keeps the world judging women for our appearances. And, there's just nothing normal or inevitable about that. This idea that a woman's worth is tied to what she looks like. And so I don't find in the end this to be a very empowering message for women. And of course, the underlying message is that we should purchase feminism, right? Rather than practicing it by calling companies to account, for their role in, perpetrating so much of the sexism and misogyny that women are up against and just the everyday challenges we're up against, right? And in the difficulty of balancing things like a corporate job with children.
Yeah, that is so important and insightful. I have a similar kind of take on this, which is that, look, I don't begrudge anyone body positivity. It was a useful entry point for me into thinking about bodies differently. And I think if it works for someone, that's wonderful. But for me, in the end, it's very difficult to maintain a monolithically, relentlessly positive attitude to almost anything, especially a subject as fraught as my own body. So I find it, in a way, it can be a little bit reminiscent of toxic positivity, like be positive about your body or else, where I think many of us do have more fraught and ambivalent relationships with our bodies, and that's okay. So another alternative that those of you in this space may have heard of is body neutrality, which I think is another, again, good option for many people in terms of thinking neutrally about the body. But it's also a little bit lackluster. It's a little wan. It's a little depressing to be purely neutral about our own bodies. And when I was researching my book, I began to think, well, why do we have to have one monolithic attitude towards our bodies whatsoever? Why is it positive, negative, neutral? It still feels like there's a scale involved. There's a kind of implicitly quantitative assessment of the body. And to me, a more liberating possibility was trying to transcend the mode of assessment altogether. And I found myself with this mantra, really, which is that my body is for me, your body is for you, and so on and so forth for everyone and every non-human animal, I would add. And that is a way of thinking about it that I call body reflexivity. And the idea is like the body is not there for an implicit assessment or correction or comparison. We don't need to be positive or neutral about the body if there's no prospect of negativity in the first place. Um, and I think there are all sorts of domains where we actually can manage to be in this kind of body reflexive space quite intuitively. Like if I watch my daughter running around with her friends at pre-K, the idea that we need kind of body positivity or neutrality is silly because there's no prospect of being negative about children's bodies, hopefully. It's just like all these sweet little kids running around, enjoying themselves in their bodies, and their body is for them. So I actually think that we can have this attitude towards everyone. The idea that we sort of need body positivity or neutrality is responsive to a way that we judge the bodies of girls and women predominantly. That is really optional, that we can undo and that we don't practice when it comes to many other kinds of bodies. So yeah, another example is the Twitter account We Rate Dogs is a parody account because we don't rate dogs. We don't need to. Every dog that they post a picture of gets over a 10 out of 10 because the whole idea is silly. Dogs are just wonderful. Like their bodies aren't there for assessment. And that's the idea that I advocate.
Oh, wow. Really, really powerful to compare that. Okay, so we'll shift gears a little bit, another really important topic. So through your research, Kara, you mentioned that women of color are the worst affected by many ills of the internet, from the way that Black women are 84% likelier to be abused online, to the underpayment of Black influencers and TikTokers, and to the stories of women trying to navigate the racism found within dating apps, which I was not aware of that. How should we navigate and combat the misogynoir and misogyny directed against women of color online?
So I think that as feminists, we have an obligation to fight racism wherever we see it. And it's not just racism against women, although of course that's important. One feminist who I've learned a lot from is Mickey Kendall. And in her book, Hood Feminism, she writes about how the racism that Black men experience in our society ultimately has a profound effect on Black women, right? If men are in prison, if men can't get jobs, that has a profound effect on their families. And so I think that we as more privileged feminists have an enormous responsibility to call out racism when we see it. A big thing that I grapple with is sort of how to do it, right? Because I think on social media, when we try to call people out, whether it's for racism or sexism, that only sort of makes things worse. And one thing we know is that if we engage with content, that sends a signal to algorithms that we like it and they show it to people more. And, tech companies don't seem to mind that they're fomenting hatred by organizing their platforms this way. And so I'm a big fan of offline conversations. Another feminist I've learned a lot from is Loretta Ross, and she talks about calling people in rather than calling them out, right, in places online. So you say to someone, I saw what you posted and I'd like to sit down with you. I'd like to have a coffee. I'd like to talk about that. And we need to socially stigmatize these practices. But also we have to support Black women. One influencer who I interviewed is just a lovely, lovely Black woman who's a running influencer. And she talked about how she would look at brands and look at the influencers they worked with, and they'd have the same follower counts and the same kinds of content that she posts, but they'd always reject her to be a brand ambassador. And part of it is, she feels like she doesn't have the typical body of a runner, right? Such as people picture it. But what if we all liked all her content, right? And followed her and amplified her work? Brands would come running to her. And so I think that there's powerful ways that we can boost the work of other women, and in particular women of color. And don't underestimate the power of simple things like follows and retweets, because that's basically a vote in our society, right? And so I really call on people of all genders, and certainly women, to follow more women and more diverse women and to amplify their content, because that will give these women a very valuable source of power.
Yeah, that is so important. And I think one thing it makes me think about is the complexity here of one of your really powerful chapters in Over the Influence is about the ways we judge women disproportionately and way too harshly online. And I think that's totally right. It's a way misogyny manifests. By far, the most common form of misogyny is not saying, oh, I hate her because she's a woman. That's in fact very rare. It's, oh, she's untrustworthy. She's a insert B word. She's a slut, all of these terrible slurs we have for women that cast doubt on their moral behavior, or she's a bad mom, or whatever it is. And so one thing that goes on that's really complex is that sometimes women do something that is criticizable, and we are warranted in making a judgment that they could do better and should be better. But then the online pylons can be excessive and collectively can become a form of internet misogyny where the woman faces disproportionate criticism because she's a woman and she's perceived as immoral in ways that a male counterpart would be subject to much less criticism. So part of the answer is to hold male counterparts, especially privileged ones, more accountable. But part of the answer too, I think, is not contributing to pylons where someone already has gotten the message that what she did is criticizable or problematic. And we don't necessarily need to say something about that if we feel like it's already been made clear that something, has gone on that someone should be called to account for. That doesn't necessarily need to happen via a million tweets. It might happen via this more interpersonal calling in process.
Yes, so we're about to shift into some audience questions in just a moment, but I thought we would end. Kate, this is for you, but Kara, definitely want your input as well. So Kate, ultimately you say that rather than changing how we view beauty, we should just work to stop judging and valuing people for how they look altogether. So what are your ideas for us on how we can create this kind of world?
Yeah, I think that thinking about the fact that judging bodies is really optional and that we don't do it for everybody. We actually tend to do it pretty selectively for girls and women. And I think we can have this view that we don't look at people with a critical eye. We think of bodies as something that serves the person whose body it is, the denizen of that body, as I call it. And there just shouldn't be this idea that someone is a quote unquote a 7 or a 3, or this idea that bodies are there to be ranked is really pernicious. And I think we can reject it and teach our children very early on that that isn't the way we think at all. It's not the way we've thought about bodies for most people, for most of human history. It's pretty much a function of misogyny and patriarchy. And it is something that we've learned and we can unlearn it, partly by thinking about how silly it would be to scrutinize and police and compare the bodies of young children or pets or something like that. So I think that's part of it. And it's also, I think, too, pulling people up short for those little comments that, again, this should be a calling in process. I don't think it needs to be something that is particularly hostile or confrontational, but it can just be if someone makes a comment even positive about someone else's appearance, changing the subject and making it clear that even a compliment can say, oh, we're examining you, we're scrutinizing you, we're policing you. So instead of saying to someone who you see, oh, you look great, you could say, it's so nice to see you. It's wonderful to lay eyes on you, to say, I'm so glad that we're making face-to-face contact, but I'm not judging how you look, and I'm not making a positive assessment that could trend negative if, because bodies change, people age, we sag, we gain weight, we go through menopause, all of these things. So yeah, one tip is to really take judgment off the table, and even compliments, I think, are something we can reassess and maybe go in for things that have more to do with being just glad to be in someone's company.
I would just add to that I think education is so important. I think the world, as we've discussed, is judging women more than ever before because now we have these platforms, social media, that enable people to do it. And so I think we need to talk about these things. Kids need to learn these things in school. I think that what we're talking about is just not obvious to so many people in our society. And so we need a bigger public conversation about this.
Well, and I loved, Cara, what you mentioned earlier about the lunch table and just your brother was just accepting, just being accepting, going in. I feel like you could extrapolate that to so many different situations. So we don't have a lot of time left, but we do have a few really good questions that I want to make sure that we get to. Thank you so much for this conversation thus far. Just so many gems that I'm pulling from it. I hope our audience is as well. So to kickstart, do you have insight on how to support tween boys through body image challenges? They seem to have more difficulty discussing the topic, but this individual has found they're very similarly affected.
Yeah, I think one thing that is useful to highlight here is that there are sort of ideals of muscularity and hypermasculinity, and one term I've heard in this space is bigorexia. So young boys both wanting to be very lean, but also to be very muscular by working out and so on. I think having open conversations about this from a young age is an important piece of this, where the stereotypical victim of or sufferer from an eating disorder is a teen girl who is often white and thin in the popular imagination. And while it's true girls are vastly disproportionately affected by eating disorders, it also affects boys. It also is something that in no way is restricted to white girls, even though they dominate our popular discourse about eating disorders, unfortunately. And it seems like non-binary kids are even worse affected, even more badly affected by eating disorders, according to research by Erin Harrop. So I think having this sense that eating disorders and more moderately disordered eating can affect anyone, and that we need to be vigilant about this, and having these conversations is really important, as is the idea that another piece of it is that we often have the idea that anyone with an eating disorder is thin, And that's statistically not the case. Many people who have eating disorders actually have larger bodies, but are really restricting what they eat or suffering from bulimia and any number of other problems here. So getting away from the stereotype of the eating disorder victim and being clear that this can affect many, many people, unfortunately, I think is an important piece of this puzzle.
And I think it's so important, not just for these individual boys, obviously, but also for society. University College London just put out a study 2 weeks ago where they set up TikTok accounts and searched for terms that typical boys would search for in the UK. And some of it was on this fitness, body image type of content that boys would search for. And unsurprisingly, although I think it's fascinating that they documented this, within 5 days of searching for this content, the amount of misogynistic content that TikTok was showing the person who started this account, standing in for a teenage boy, quadrupled in 5 days. So these algorithms are getting the message.
That's so disturbing. Wow.
Is well, and it just goes back to that, like the unfollowing and curating and working with the child to curate their own the positive messages. Oh, okay. So another audience question here. You mentioned the trouble that lack of information or even misinformation can bring when following advice from social media. But are there ways that people can more easily spot dangerous information or tips to see through these posts that at first glance they do seem believable?
So my advice is don't get medical advice online. If you have a question about your child, call their pediatrician. That's their job. Call your doctor, call your OB to get advice. But I think the larger message is just that we have to fact check everything we see on social media before acting on it or believing it or sharing it. Pretty much every election expert in this country expects deepfakes to play a significant role in the upcoming presidential election in the United States. And so whether it's misinformation targeted to mothers or anything else that affects our lives, I just think we need to be incredibly skeptical and learn to do that independent fact checking and look for people with expertise who can give us credible information.
Absolutely. Kate, anything else?
Yeah, no, I think that is so important. And I would say too that it depends on the platform a bit, but I have been really worried about, say, YouTube algorithms and reports that I have read that the videos that quickly come up, especially for teen boys, once they're, on the platform, even if they're searching for quite innocent things, quickly turn to Andrew Tate style misogyny. I think there is a really good case for strict parental controls around that. Like, it's not difficult. It is like a little unwieldy, but my sense is that as a parent, you can really like limit what YouTube channels are available to a child. And I think the YouTube rabbit hole is something that we really need to help kids not be sucked down. So yeah, I had there was an episode recently of the Burnt Toast podcast with Virginia Saul Smith and a social media expert whose name I'm blanking on at this moment, but it was a recent episode, and their sense was YouTube is one of the forms of content that parents should be like really in charge of what channels their children can actually access, because the misogyny, the misinformation, the racism, all sorts of things can crop up very, very quickly that the child is not looking for. But again, they don't necessarily yet have the critical thinking skills to back away from what they're being sold.
Well, I feel like I could continue having this conversation with both of you. It makes sense. You're both professors. We could have a 3-hour talk on this. But I want to thank you both so much for your time tonight. To the audience, we will, of course, put these 2 wonderful books. We'll put the information in the post-event communication. There's clearly much, much more to dive into that the books get into. And I hope that everyone will consider joining us for future Spark Your Health events. We have a lot coming up over the next few weeks. So it's a very exciting time. And I look forward to, hopefully all of us will employ some of these amazing tips that you gave us here tonight, and we'll keep working on making the social media platforms, body images, and just the world in general a better place.